We like to think that the truth is absolute, that if you're innocent, you would never say that you're guilty. But the human mind is fragile, under the weight of a dim interrogation room, and stripped of sleep, and fed lies by those meant to protect us. The line between memory and fiction can blur. Today, we're looking at 10 people who confessed to crimes that they never committed. This is the anatomy of the false confession. The Central Park Five and a City on Fire. In the spring of 1989, New York City was not just a place, it was a powder keg of racial tension and fear. When a 28-year-old investment banker was found brutally assaulted in Central Park, the city demanded a sacrifice. Enter 5 boys: Kevin, Antron, Raymond, Corey, and Yusef. The interrogation was a marathon of psychological erosion. For over 14 hours, these kids were held without food, sleep, or parental guidance. The detectives did not ask what happened, they told them. They used the false friend tactic, whispering that if they just pointed a finger at one of the others, they could go home and sleep in their own beds. By the time the cameras rolled for the videotaped confessions, the boys were reciting scripts written by the police. They got the locations wrong, they got the sequence of events wrong, but to a jury in 1990, a taped confession was an unbeatable truth. It took 13 years and a chance meeting in a prison yard with the real attacker, Matias Reyes, to prove that the only crime these 5 committed was being in the wrong park at the wrong time in history. The West Memphis 3, the devil in the details. If New York was fueled by fear of the streets, West Memphis, Arkansas was fueled by fear of the shadows. In 1993, the discovery of 3 young boys in a creek bed triggered a hunt for Satanists. They landed on Jesse Miskelly Jr., a young man with an IQ in the low 70s. Jesse was interrogated for 12 hours. Imagine the cognitive load. A high-pressure environment, leading questions, and a desperate need to please authority. Jesse eventually gave them a story about a black-robed cult. But listen to the tapes. The detectives are practically feeding him the facts. When he says the murders happened at noon, they correct him to say the evening. When he misses a detail, they remind him. Despite no blood and no DNA and no physical evidence linking Jesse, Damian Eccles, or Jason Baldwin to the scene, the confession acted as a legal anchor. It didn't matter that the details didn't align with the autopsy. The community wanted a monster, and Jesse, under duress, gave them 3. The case of Christopher Tapp is perhaps the most frightening because it demonstrates internalized false confession. In 1996, after the murder of Angie Dodge, Tapp was subjected to over 20 hours of questioning and multiple polygraphs. The police did not just lie about evidence, they lied about Tapp's own mind. They told him he had repressed the memory of the murder. They used the polygraph, a notoriously unreliable tool, to prove to him that he was lying when he said he was innocent. Eventually, Tapp began to hallucinate memories to fill the gaps that the police created. He didn't just confess to escape the room, he confessed because he was gaslit into believing that he was the killer. He spent 2 decades in a cell for a crime he eventually remembered doing, only for 2019 DNA technology to prove his mind had been colonized by someone else's narrative. The Norfolk 4, the persistence of error. In 1997, the brutal rape and murder of Michelle Moore Bosco rocked the Navy town of Norfolk, Virginia. What followed was a legal nightmare that defied all logic. It began with Daniel Williams, a neighbor and fellow sailor. Under high-pressure interrogation tactics that lasted for hours, Williams broke. He confessed, but the DNA results came back and they didn't match him. Instead of admitting a mistake, the lead detective, Robert Glenn Ford, doubled down. He decided Williams must have had an accomplice. He brought in Joseph Dick. After being threatened with the death penalty, Dick also confessed and named two more, Derek Tice and Eric Wilson. Even as the confessions grew to include 8 different men, the DNA still only pointed to one person, Omar Ballard, a convicted rapist who was already in prison. Ballard eventually admitted he committed the crime alone. He gave details no one else knew, but the prosecution refused to delete their narrative. They forced the original men to testify that Ballard was their ringleader. These 4 sailors, with no criminal records, spent years behind bars despite the physical evidence shouting their innocence. It wasn't until 2017 that they were finally granted absolute pardons, a chilling reminder that sometimes the system would rather be right than just. Hugh Gilt, the execution of innocence. The case of Hugh Gilt is a haunting tragedy of speed over substance. In 1996, in a public restroom in Inner Mongolia, a woman was attacked and killed. 18-year-old Hugh Gilt, a local factory worker, was the one who discovered her and ran to find help. In a devastating turn of irony, his civic duty made him the prime suspect. Under the Strike Hard anti-crime campaign in China at the time, police were under immense pressure to solve cases quickly. Hugh Gilt was interrogated for 48 hours straight. He eventually signed a confession. There was no DNA evidence, no witnesses, and no motive, just a signature on a piece of paper. The trial lasted only hours. He was executed by firing squad just 61 days after the crime occurred. 9 years later, a serial killer named Zhao Zihong was captured and confessed to the murder, providing details about the restroom layout and the victim that only the killer could know. Hugh Gilt's parents spent a decade petitioning the government to look at the evidence. In 2014, the court finally overturned the conviction. They handed his parents a check for state compensation, a meager consolation for a son whose life was stolen by a forced confession and a rushed execution. The Beatrice 6, the fabricated memory. In 1985, Beatrice, Nebraska was a small town looking for answers in the murder of Helen Wilson. What makes the Beatrice 6 unique is how the confessions were not just forced, they were manufactured through psychological suggestion. The lead investigator, Bert Searcy, believed the crime was a group effort. He used a technique known as recovered memory therapy. He convinced several of the suspects, including Joseph White and Ada Joanne Taylor, that they had witnessed the murder but had suppressed the memory because it was too traumatic. They were told that their dreams were actually repressed memories. Under the haze of these suggestions, several of the 6 began to confess to a crime they had no part in. They began to believe their own lies. It was a collective hallucination fueled by a detective's theory. They served a combined 70 years in prison. In 2008, DNA testing on blood and semen from the scene proved that a man named Bruce Allen Smith, who had died years earlier, was the sole perpetrator. The memories the 6 had confessed to were nothing more than ghosts conjured in an interrogation room. Brandon Dassey, The Loss of Language. Brendan Dassey's story, popularized by Making a Murderer, is perhaps the most famous modern example of a coerced confession involving a minor with cognitive disabilities. In 2006, the 16-year-old Brendan, who struggled with a low IQ and significant communication barriers, was pulled out of school by investigators. The video of his interrogation is painful to watch. The investigators used the read technique, a method that relies on building a rapport and suggesting that honesty, which they define as a confession, is the only way out. They told Brendan they already knew what happened. They fed him specific details, like the victim being shot in the head, after he repeatedly failed to guess how she died. Brendan, wanting to please the authority figures and clearly not understanding the gravity of the situation, at the end of the confession, he asked if he could go back to school to finish a project, seemingly unaware that he had just confessed to a life sentence crime. Despite a total lack of physical evidence linking him to the scene, his own words became his prison. Robert Lee Stinson, the bite mark trap. For 23 years, Robert Lee Stinson lived in a cell because of a pseudoscience and a forced admission. In 1984, a woman was murdered in Milwaukee, and the prosecution's star evidence was a set of bite marks on the victim. A forensic odontologist claimed the marks were a perfect match for Stinson's teeth. When Stinson was interrogated, the police used the certainty of evidence tactic. They told him they had scientific proof that he did it. When a person is told their own body has betrayed them, they often enter a state of shock. Stinson made several contradictory statements while trying to explain how his teeth could be at a crime scene he wasn't at. The prosecution twisted these confused details into a confession of guilt. In 2009, the Wisconsin Innocence Project took the case. New DNA testing on the victim's sweater showed the DNA belonged to a man named Moses Price. Furthermore, a panel of experts reviewed the bite marks and concluded that they didn't match Stinson at all. The original expert had been completely wrong. Stinson walked free, but he left behind over 2 decades of his life in a grave made of bad science. The Lindbergh Confessors. In 1932, the kidnapping of the Lindbergh baby was the crime of the century. It was a global sensation, but as the police scrambled for leads, they were met with a bizarre phenomenon. Over 200 different people walked into police stations across the country and confessed to the crime. Most of these people had no connection to the Lindbergh family. Some were mentally ill, suffering from messiah complexes, or severe guilt from unrelated parts of their lives. Others were fame seekers, in an era where being a notorious criminal was a way to escape a mundane life. The Lindbergh Confessors represent the extreme end of the human psyche, the desire to be seen, even if it's through the bars of a cell. They forced the FBI and local police to waste thousands of man-hours vetting fake stories, proving that sometimes the undeleted stories we tell are the ones we wish to be true, just to feel like we matter. From the psychological pressure of a small Nebraska town to the global stage of the Lindbergh case, we see that a confession is not always a window into the truth. Sometimes it's a mirror reflecting our deepest fears and flaws. 10 stories, 10 lives upended. It reminds us that the justice system is only as good as the people running it. Thank you for joining us on UnDeleted Stories. If you enjoyed this content, hit the like button and subscribe to the channel.